Unit 4, Queries. Topic A, Create Select Queries. A query in a database like Access is simply a way to extract data in a meaningful way. So instead of looking and trying to sift through and sort and filter through all the data in order to extract useful information, we use queries to extract and select particular information based on a number of selection criteria. I have in front of me the Northwind sample database, and when we look at the different object types, I'm looking at queries, and you'll see that the sample database has quite a number of different queries. Most of these queries are what we call select queries, and a select query is simply a way of selecting specific information based on selection criteria and placing the resulting data on a data sheet inside the database so that you can view it. So when I look at, for instance, the customer's extended query, which is one of the queries that is on the left here, what I'm looking at here is not the query itself. This is in fact the result of the query. So when a query is executed, because a query is really a command or a set of commands that is executed in Access, the result of that set of commands is displayed as a query data sheet, and it looks like a table, and this is important to understand. This looks exactly like a table. It has columns and it has fields and it has records, or so-called what looks like records, but in fact it is not a table. The technical term for the result of a query is that it is transient, which means that the result is not permanent. It's not as though when you run a query you're creating new data. When I close this query, I have not created anything new, and the results of that query simply disappear because the results can easily be regenerated the moment I run a query. So if I double click on a query in the object view on the left, what I'm actually doing is I'm executing the query, and the result of the query is now being displayed as a data sheet. Now, queries form the basis for reports and forms, which we'll use later on. And in most properly designed Access databases, a query sits literally underneath and supplies the data to a form or a report, and therefore it is important that you understand how to use queries to make a selection and to display the selected data properly. Let's start off by creating a query and looking at the different ways in which we can create queries. And we're fortunate that Access has a very simple and very powerful query wizard. So when you look at the Create ribbon under Queries, you'll see that we basically have two ways to create a query. One is through the query wizard, which I'll show you now, and the other one is through Query Design. Now, before we go into the two, I'd like to show you what the query actually looks like in Design View. This is a view of the inventory query, and this is what it would look like in the Design View of the query. I'm dragging the lower half of the screen so that you can see that the top half of the query screen contains all of the different tables or queries which the result of this query is drawn from. Now, interesting to note that a query is typically based on a table or a selection of tables, and here you see all the different tables in this query. But a query can also be based on another query or a selection of queries or tables, and that is entirely a function of the design of your database. The next thing I want to show you is that similar to the relationship view which we saw earlier, these tables or queries, whichever they might be, are also joined with little link lines. And when I open up the join properties, it looks very similar to the link lines that we saw in the relationship table. We have typically on the left a primary entity, and on the right a related entity, and we have some sort of a common key, for instance a primary key and a related key that joins the different entities in a query. This is an example of a fairly advanced query which I'm not going to discuss in more detail. I simply want to show you that there is a third way to look at queries, and that is the so-called SQL view. Now, when I go to the different views that are available for queries, we've seen the datasheet view, which displays the result of the query. We have now also seen the design view, which displays the graphical design for the query, and it's graphical in the sense that you can manipulate the different query entities graphically by dragging them around. But then thirdly, there is also the so-called SQL view of the query. You'll notice that the spelling there is SQL, which stands for Structured Query Language, which is a common database language used by most modern relational databases. But the proper way of pronouncing that is SQL, although it is spelled SQL. So in the SQL view, what you're actually seeing is a bit of programming, and you don't need to worry about what you're reading here. If you go on a more advanced course, or if you have a programming background, you will recognize some of this. But for now, in case you ever get here and you wonder what on earth this is, don't worry too much about it. Simply go back to the views and either view the query in the datasheet view or in the design view. All you need to know about the SQL view is that what happens in this graphical view of the query is that whatever we design here is translated back into code. That code is executed by the database engine, and the result of that code is then displayed as the query result, which is a data sheet. If we had to go back and look at how we create queries, we said that there's a query wizard and a query design. Query design takes us back to this view where we're able to graphically manipulate the particular query entities, which could be tables or queries or both. And we are able to create a query by dragging particular entities. No, let's revert. We're able to create a query by selecting a particular entity and clicking the add button. So I'm adding customers and invoices, and I'm closing the show table. And then importantly, for the query to really operate well, if it's a multiple source query, is to go and create a join between the two tables. Now in this instance, I know that these two tables cannot be joined directly because there is no common field between invoice and customers. So in this particular example, if I try to run a query out of these two tables, I would get a garbled result. So I'm going to remove the table, and I do that simply by right-clicking on the table and removing it. And I'm going to show you the easier, more intuitive way to create a query, which does not for which you do not need to have as much technical knowledge about Access. So let me go back to create to the two different types of queries and go click on the query wizard. Now I've created a previous query which I'm going to discard. I'm simply going to say no, I don't want to save this query. Let's get rid of it. And let's go and create a new query using a query wizard. Let's start again. We're going to create a new query not using the query design, which is more complicated, but using the query wizard. Now, it is difficult to create a query in any database if you don't have data. So I suggest when we start working or when you start practicing queries, wherever you do this on your own, that you have a database in front of you with at least 1 or 2 tables, so that you can create a query on top of tables. Without any base information, the query itself is a meaningless entity. So I'm using the Northwind sample database, and I'm going to create a very simple new query based on the tables that are already in the database. So I'm clicking on create. In the query section there, I'm going to click on query wizard, and it opens up this little wizard, and it asks to start off with what sort of query do we want. Now the 4 different types are standard, but the one that you're going to use most of all is the simple query wizard. The function of the other 3 are very specific, and we're not going to deal with them in this section of the topic. We're not going to deal with them in this unit. So I'm going to select the simple query wizard, click OK, and the query wizard will then say, ask me what is it that I want to query, and I would say I want to query the table called customers, or if I drop the list down, I can query a table or I can query a query, but let's keep it simple. I'm going to query a table called customers, and now it says, okay, we need something to work on. So let me say that I want to see the company name, and I want to see the first name and the last name of the representative for that company. And maybe let's also include a mobile phone number and a city. Or I could, if I wanted to query all the different fields in that table, simply click the little button that says include everything. Or conversely, exclude everything. So there are the include everything and exclude everything buttons. Or I could simply select and do a selection on a one-to-one basis. So there's company, first name, last name, and let's put city in there just for the sake of the example. Interesting here that you'll see it is good practice when we deal with people in any database to always separate the first name and the last name, and not to try and contain both of those data entities into a single field. And the reason for that is that sometimes we want to sort on a last name or a first name, and if those entities are contained in a single field, that sorting becomes very difficult. So we're building a simple query using the query wizard. I'm going to click next. We can call this query anything we like, so let's call it city, because what I want to do is understand how many cities there are and which cities are represented in our customer base. Now I have the option to open the query to view the information or to modify the design of the query. So if I open the query to view the information and I click finish, you can now imagine that what's going to happen is the query is going to select all of the fields that I've selected and only display the information in those fields and not the rest. So when I click Finish, the query runs, and the result of the query is that it displays those 4 fields that we selected and only those 4. And this is the most basic select query. It's called a select query because we have selected to display only particular fields from a particular table. Select queries can become a lot more complicated, but for now that's the basis of a select query. If we now had to look at this, the query from a design perspective, if we viewed this query in the design view, what we are seeing is that the table that we selected is now sitting in the top, and in the bottom, in the query grid, we are seeing 1, 2, 3, 4 fields, and those are the fields that we selected using the wizard. This is the most simple query design that you can have.